Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
And welcome to the BBC News at 6. The Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn says socialism for the 21st century will be at the heart of his appeal to voters. And he wants an end to what he called trench warfare in his own party. Speaking at the Labour conference in Liverpool, he set out a series of pledges, saying they deliver greater equality. Our political editor Laura Koonsberg watched the speech.
The leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn.
Coming out on top, in charge of his party. So what happens now? There's no change in the devotion of his followers. But this is his offer to you.
Thank you. It's the socialism of the 21st century. Our job is now to win over the unconvinced of our vision. No one will be convinced of a vision promoted by a divided party. We all agree on that. So I ask each and every one of you to accept the decision of the members, end the trench warfare and work together to take on the Tories.
To suits at the front, supporters at the back, he made his 10 familiar promises, coming to a leaflet near you.
For full employment, a homes guarantee, security at work, a strong public national health service and social care, a national education service for all.
Vows too on climate change, public services, inequality and peace. His articles of faith.
Don't worry, conference, they're not the 10 commandments. I haven't come down from the mountain with them.
There was no bold offer to colleagues who didn't support him. He needs them if Labour can convincingly make this attack.
This isn't a new government. It's David Cameron's government repackaged with progressive slogans but with a new, harsh, right-wing edge. Who seriously believes that the Tories could ever stand up to the privileged few? They are the party of the privileged few. Their only plan is the return of grammar schools, segregation and second-class schooling for the majority. Labour is standing up for education for all.
There'd be a bigger tax on business to pay for education. But despite the referendum result, on anxieties over immigration, his aims to ease the strains, not cut the numbers.
A Labour government will not offer false promises on immigration, as the Tories have done. We will not sow division by fanning the flames of fear. We will act decisively to end the undercutting of workers' pay and conditions through the exploitation of migrant labour and agency working. Labour will reinstate the Migrant Impact Fund and give extra support to areas of high migration.
He was confident, but in his comfort zone. And 10 years after Tony Blair made his last conference speech, Mr Corbyn was applauded for opposition to Iraq.
I believe it was right to apologise on behalf of the party for the Iraq war. Right to say that we learned the lessons.
He had stern words on anti-Semitism and abuse and urged the party to forget their private battles and focus on the public.
We are 500,000 of us, and there will be many more, working together to make our country the place it could be. Conference, united, we can shape the future and build a fairer Britain in a peaceful world. Thank you.
It was a grand-sounding vision for socialism for the 21st century, but it was more Jeremy Corbyn's greatest hits, a broad outline of his long-held beliefs, then a detailed argument to persuade you to vote Labour at the next election.
Do you think the public is ready for 21st century socialism?
Do you know what's about? They're ready for it, they need it. And I think it's our job now to explain to them how this system is leaving them behind.
And I'm very pleased that we've got 21st century socialism. I'm absolutely delighted.
Very well received in the audience. I think it goes down well in the country as well.
The people's flag is deepest red.
Jeremy Corbyn's supporters believe his Labour is much more than a cover version of the party of old. But echoes of the past are all around. He's inspired thousands on the left, but is yet to show that millions will join his chorus. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Liverpool.
Well, one of the biggest challenges Labour faces is addressing the concerns of voters on immigration. And today, as we've heard, Mr Corbyn said his party's approach would focus on managing its impact on pay and public services. Well, our special correspondent, Ed Thomas, has been talking to voters in Bramley in West Yorkshire, and he's there for us now. Ed.
Clive, this part of Leeds has seen attacks on Polish workers post the European referendum. The local MP here warned of division and said this place was like a tinderbox. But today, Jeremy Corbyn made his pitch to people here, to voters, that he can solve the question of immigration.
Immigration, an issue that can sink a politician. Why? Because it seems everyone has an opinion.
Does immigration matter to you?
For me, it's about job security.
Everybody has the right to go and seek happiness wherever they can find it.
I think it's quite important. It isn't the only important issue at the minute in Britain.
They can be choppy waters, but today Jeremy Corbyn made his pitch to these people. More support for services under pressure, but no false promises, no set limits and no divisive language.
I think there's more tension here in recent months.
A tone on immigration that appeals to some.
I think it's important that we're all talking together and trying to understand each other. For me personally, it's very important that we're not using inflammatory language and that we're not creating further tension or division between different groups.
Labour's plan is more money, targeted for cities with high immigration and fairer wages for all workers.
It needs to be managed. We need a new consensus on migration. I believe we're beginning to get there, but we need to make sure that everyone feels better off as a result of migration, and every single area in this country is better off as a result of migration.
Is it about numbers, though? Just too many people coming in?
For us, it's not about that. Migration is neither good nor bad. It's simply about how we deal with it as a country.
For many here, there is an instinct towards Labour. But the European referendum showed that the party's message isn't always getting through. And when it comes to immigration, the challenge is to convince voters that Labour has the answers.
We haven't got the space.
And those who need to be convinced, people like Maureen and Frank. Labour voters all their lives until now.
The resources isn't there, the money isn't there to do what he wants to do.
Jeremy Corbyn's presenting a clear strategy on immigration.
He doesn't, he's too weak. Too weak.
Does he convince you?
No, not at all.
But Jeremy Corbyn has set out his plan, a vision for Britain in uncertain times. His solution on the issue of immigration. Ed Thomas, BBC News, Leeds.
Labour can climb an electoral mountain, Jeremy Corbyn said this afternoon in his closing speech to the Labour Party conference in Liverpool. The Labour leader said his party had to be ready to fight a general election next year and appealed to it to end its trench warfare and take on the Tories. He also said there would be no false promises on immigration numbers, but a new fund for high migration areas instead. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, watched the speech.
75% of Labour MPs said they had no confidence in him and tried to topple him before he'd been a year in the job. The wider party just voted Jeremy Corbyn back in with a strengthened mandate. Today, Jeremy Corbyn tried to take on the criticism that a life of protest on the left means he just doesn't get the need to win elections.
So yes, our party is about campaigning, and it's about protest too. But most of all, it's about winning power in local and national government, to deliver the real change our country so desperately needs.
This week, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, was amongst those suggesting Mr Corbyn didn't get elections. Mr Corbyn acknowledged Labour had an electoral mountain to climb, but he said they mustn't patronise those who voted for Brexit. But he refused to promise any kind of immigration control, saying the problem was bosses underpaying migrants and public sector cuts.
A Labour government will not offer false promises on immigration, as the Tories have done. We will not sow division by fanning the flames of fear. We will tackle the real issues of immigration instead. That is the Labour way to tackle social tension, investment and assistance, not racism and division.
Virtually none of the 63 MPs who resigned from Jeremy Corbyn's team this summer was in the hall. He's hoping some will now come back. But he said many of the MPs from the left who'd stepped into top jobs would keep them. The face of Labour has changed.
But let me also pay a particular tribute to those parliamentary colleagues who stepped forward in the summer to fill the gaps in the shadow cabinet.
The new team applauded that, as did the hall, showing their displeasure at those who tried to topple Mr Corbyn.
This conference should thank them today. They are our future.
Jeremy Corbyn condemned anti-Semitic abuse by some of his most zealous supporters. But his critics say it shows what dark forces lurk in his mass movement. But a Labour leader feels he has to say this.
Let me be absolutely clear. Anti-Semitism is an evil. It led to the worst crimes of the 20th century. Every one of us has a responsibility to ensure that it is never allowed to fester in our society again.
The most rampant applause came when he attacked the Iraq War and promised to end arms sales to Saudi Arabia.
British arms sales will be suspended, starting with Saudi Arabia.
Jeremy Corbyn promised more powers for councils to borrow to boost council house building, money for the arts in schools. But he said Labour needed unity to deliver these policies.
And let's be frank, no one will be convinced of a vision promoted by a divided party. We all agree on that. So I ask each and every one of you to accept the decision of the members, end the trench warfare and work together to take on the Tories.
Yesterday, the Deputy Leader, Tom Watson, said the party should be about reforming capitalism, not replacing it. Today, Jeremy Corbyn sounded like he was on a similar page. Much of the speech could have been delivered by his predecessor, Ed Miliband.
The people's flag is deepest red.
But he and his team often sound and look more strident. In their first troubled year of leadership, they've shown their inexperience. And Jeremy Corbyn returns in a couple of weeks to Westminster, where he's surrounded not by adoring supporters, but MPs who believe he's an electoral catastrophe waiting to happen. Gary Gibbon, Channel 4 News at the Labour Party conference in Liverpool.
Well, now, Jeremy Corbyn's defence of immigration wasn't welcomed by everyone in his shadow cabinet, including Andy Burnham, his departing shadow Home Secretary. Mr Burnham argued today that lifelong Labour members had voted for change in migrant numbers in the EU referendum vote. Our political correspondent Michael Crick spent the day in Stoke-on-Trent to gauge how Mr Corbyn's promise to end false promises on controlling immigration numbers went down with the voters there.
When it came to voting for Brexit in June, few places in England did so more strongly than Stoke-on-Trent. Remain were trounced here and got barely 30% of the vote. Immigration seems to have been a big reason for that.
Immigration's a big problem.
In what way?
There's just too many of them. There's not enough houses and for our own people. Without keep rehousing all these immigrants that keep coming across and saying we'll give 20,000 houses to them and all this, and there isn't enough for our own people.
My son's been waiting 2 years for he's on disability. He's got rheumatoid arthritis and he can't get anywhere to live, and yet they can find foreigners who are coming in now straight away.
At the Labour conference in Liverpool, Andy Burnham confirmed he'll soon step down as Shadow Home Secretary so as to stand for Mayor of Greater Manchester. He highlighted Labour's problem with immigration.
This party must fully face up
to this fact. Millions of lifelong Labour supporters voted to leave the EU, and let's be honest, they voted for change on immigration. We haven't yet even begun to show them that we understand why.
The estate was built in the 1950s in a linear...
Back in Stoke, in the last decade, hundreds of Poles have come to live in the former mining community of Bentley, with very few problems, says the boss of the local housing association.
This area has definitely benefited from immigration. 97% of our Polish tenants are in work. These results in the local schools have improved significantly over the last 5 or 6 years, and all our homes that we own are filled with people who are in need of those homes. So I think the estate has worked very, very well in terms of integrating, and it is now, if you talk to any residents on the estate, I'm certain they would say this is a much better place to live in now than it was 10 or 15 years ago.
A lot of Poles have moved into this area, I believe.
They have, yes.
And has that been good for the area?
Well, yes, I've got Polish neighbours and they're brilliant. You know, they please, thank you, hello, goodbye, not rude at all.
So you'd carry on letting Poles come into the country, would you?
I wouldn't, as such. It's control, isn't it? It's controlling who comes in.
I already think they should close the borders, to be honest with you. I really do think they should close the borders. I mean, that's just my opinion, you know.
You always vote Labour?
Yeah.
Would you change your vote if Labour carried on letting lots of immigrants in?
Well, yeah, because I've always been a Labour voter.
So Labour can say what they like and you'll still vote Labour?
Yeah.
Michael Crick, Channel 4 News, Stoke-on-Trent.
And on to other things. In Liverpool, it was Jeremy Corbyn's big day, his second conference speech as leader, an hour long. It was, undoubtedly, considerably more confidently delivered than some of his others. More cleverly populist in its themes. I thought more aspiration, optimism and sunny socialist upland than you sometimes get. And a number of specific ideas in there too. Perhaps a bit lacking in humour. But let's hear what our political editor thinks. Nick Watt is with me. What did you think, Nick?
Well, this was Jeremy Corbyn's best speech on a national stage. His aides are joking that he's been learning on the job, but a year into the job and after that challenge, this was the most fluent and polished performance that we've seen from Jeremy Corbyn. Now, there were some messages for his critics who say, look, you're only interested in forming and leading a protest group. And he said, protest and campaigning is at the heart of the Labour movement. But the most important thing it does is it seeks to win power at a national and local level to improve people's lives. Now, he did have messages for his supporters. He did say that it was right for him to apologise on behalf of the Labour Party for the Iraq War. And we did hear on 4 occasions the word that dare not speak its name, socialism.
Yeah.
But as he put the Labour Party on an election footing, it did feel like an attempt to reach out to the wider electorate and really explain some of the ideas, the policies that would form the heart of an election campaign led by him. These would be, for example, allowing councils to borrow against their housing stock to allow an extra 12,000 homes to be built a year, and also encouraging children to learn an instrument through a 160 million arts pupil premium programme. But as his critics say, as Ed Miliband found out, you can dream the greatest dreams in the world, but unless you have economic credibility, nobody will take you seriously.
Right. OK, conference over. Corbyn was the last act. What happens now?
Jeremy Corbyn, it looks like he will finally reshuffle his front bench towards the end of the next week before he reaches agreement with the Parliamentary Labour Party on elections to the shadow cabinet. Now, that's not going to happen until November. I spoke to 2 former front benchers who say they are going to go back next week. They say, look, it's a time to pull together, and actually some of those people who are in favour of shadow cabinet elections opposed them a few years ago, and they think that around a dozen will go back. But there is a much larger group of former frontbenchers who won't go back. They've appointed John Cryer, the chairman of the Parliamentary Labour Party, as their informal shop steward. Spoke to one of their number today. They said, we've heard about the olive tree, but we haven't seen the olive branches yet. They need movement 2 areas. 1, clear undertaking from Jeremy Corbyn. He will discourage deselections and movement on those shadow cabinet elections.
Nick, thank you very much. Well, you've heard Nick and I, but everybody knows that it is not the mainstream media that matters, not the pundits, not the members. It is what the public think that matters, which is why we sent Chris Cook to the marginal constituency of Bury North, which is in the north part of Bury, in Greater Manchester. What did the folks there make of it? Or at least the ones who we enticed into sitting down to watch the speech.
Bury, on the outskirts of Manchester, was the home of Robert Peel,
a man who transformed the Conservative Party. And in a pub that bears his name, we assembled a panel of voters to appraise Jeremy Corbyn, who has also changed Labour. One is a paid-up fan of Mr Corbyn, one is a new voter, and three are winnable voters who have previously voted Labour. The issue that most divided this group was economics, specifically Mr Corbyn's plans for more public spending.
We've set out proposals for a national investment bank with 500 billion of investment to bring our broadband, our railways, our housing and our energy infrastructure up to scratch.
Borrow 500 billion, did you say, or million? 500 billion?
Billion.
Yeah.
500 billion. It's paying it back.
Our country's history is based on individual ingenuity and collective
and get it back in. But borrowing money is what left us vulnerable to the global financial crisis. Well, no, I agree with what you're saying in some respects, but equally, what are we going to do? Let all the services, you know, the NHS, our roads, you know, infrastructure. We need to invest. We really do.
And build a fairer Britain in a peaceful world. Thank you.
And we have to make sure that
But it still has
corporates
to
are
be
paying the taxes.
And no one would disagree with that. No one would disagree that corporates should be paying the right taxes. That's something that's a given. I think adding extra percentage onto national insurance for all businesses is almost like throwing out the baby with the bathwater, which I think he does in a number of policies, like zero-hour contracts. I think there's some people that suit zero-hour contracts.
Mr Corbyn also set out a Liberal position on immigration, which this group was pretty relaxed about. But they acknowledged others would disagree.
Where are they going to go? It's an island, isn't it? But so you can see where that speech could be a bit problematic then. Precisely. That's like I said, the people I'm talking to, it's not a racist point around it, with the amount, not the...
Still, Mr Corbyn impressed this group of voters, even if he didn't win them all over.
I'd like to hear more about his plan for the economy, especially about borrowing. I agree that austerity hasn't worked, but we've also seen that borrowing hasn't worked in the past, so I'd like to see what his plans are to actually make it work.
I think that speech was sound bites for people who you were talking about who feel left behind. I don't think it was for people who had an opinion. I just think there was no meat on the bones. What he said was great. How he's going to do it, nobody knows.
Would this make you more likely to vote for them?
Yeah, now that I've listened to him properly. So, because like with Tony Blair, I only voted him because I never liked the bloke anyway, but it was the better of the options. So now that I've listened to him, yeah, I will be carrying on voting Labour.
All in all, a rather positive verdict on Mr Corbyn's first speech in his second leadership term.
Chris Cook in Bury North. Well, joining us is Phil Collins from The Times, a former speechwriter for Tony Blair, who happens to come from Bury North, by the way, and Paul Mason, broadcaster and columnist for The Guardian. Very good evening to you. Do you think it's sellable, what you heard today, Paul? Phil?
No. One of the problems with the propositions that Jeremy Corbyn put out, with every single clip we saw, is that it had Jeremy Corbyn in it. And that's one of the problems, is leadership's an incredible problem. The speech itself was much better than he's done before, clearly, and lots that was in it is entirely unobjectionable. And I don't mind either that it's vague at this stage in the Parliament. Every single opposition leader is vague at this stage in the Parliament, so we've got to be fair to him. But I do wonder whether a speech which essentially could have been delivered by Ed Miliband without Ed Balls' restraining influence. It's sort of Ed Miliband turned up to 11. Whether that is sellable now, when it so clearly wasn't sellable a few years ago, I very much doubt that's changed.
Paul. Well, the salespeople will be, 650,000 and rising Labour members who, as I think we both realise, in that conference, little as the conference does reflect a major party, are very energised and very enthusiastic about this. And like me, many of them have been waiting 20 years to hear a Labour leader say, free market economics is over, it causes inequality, it leads to unjust wars, and we're going to stop it. I mean, I think it will genuinely into that pub at some point will walk a Labour activist, and they'll have a discussion and a pint, and hopefully some people will come out voting for Corbyn.
And Paul, was Corbyn your first choice to take this message? Because one of the stories going around is actually that everybody thinks Corbyn was meant to go in 2018 and then be replaced by somebody else who had been more
It's not so much meant to, but before the coup of June 2016, I think there was that part, not the part I support, but that part around, say, Lisa Nandy, Owen Smith. We're all discussing about, well, you know, how do we position ourselves if Corbyn does do a sort of succession thing? But that's stymied by the fact, I mean, in fact, you know, I think history has been made. Maybe that would have happened, but it won't happen now.
Right. Is it possible to put together a leftist populist kind of agenda? Because he's an outsider. He's saying we're going to smash the system. It's going to be very, very different. As does Donald Trump, in fact, say that. Can left-wing politicians pull that off in the way that Trump is obviously pulling it off with 30 or 40% of the Americans?
The tradition in this country has been, the answer seems to be no, and I'm not saying it can never change, but there's absolutely no warrant in any British political history that this is the case, and I cannot imagine how the people of Bury North, having not only 15 months ago, they voted Conservative. There's a Tory MP there. How all of a sudden a Labour activist goes into the pub in Bury and they all change their minds? Because I'll go into the pub as well and tell them, don't change your minds. And
vote Tory?
Well, they're going to vote Tory because they will make up their own minds. And the notion that they are going to be enticed by a left-wing shopping list with, as the guy said, we've no idea how he's going to do it. That credibility gap is something that Corbyn has to address. Let's try and be positive and think, how would you make it work? Well, that's one thing they've got to go through. You've got to go through economic credibility before any of those things are viable.
That's the old wisdom.
And I think that was
the conventional wisdom. Is it still true?
There was an element of it there because he started talking about Bristol, the mayoral, Bristol, Liverpool, Sadiq Khan. He's saying the stepping stones will be to prove competence. But I think, first of all, I object to the idea that this is left-wing populism. No left-wing populist would have done what he did today, which is stand up and give that absolutely pro-migration down the line. And to be honest, it's what Labour people, Labour working class people in places like that do every day. They don't sit there saying, yes, we understand your concerns over migration. They say, you know what, mate, you are wrong. It's not the migrants' fault, it's the boss's fault. It's the oldest argument in the Labour
so it wasn't
book,
so populist. But Paula, is it the case, do you think, that the argument over economic credibility and being able to answer the question, do the sums add up, which is the question that's asked ad nauseam in election campaigns, has that all gone now?
No.
Because in America, half the population seems to think you don't have to worry about rational argument on these kinds of things.
Look, no, I don't think, well, in a year when the Bank of England printed 60 billion extra, spent 50 billion of it on government bonds and yet to spend another 10 on corporate bonds, I mean, that's 60% of the 100 billion a year that Corbyn wants to borrow and leverage in via this National Investment Bank. People in that pub were saying, where's he going to get that money from? Well, I think we can actually explain it. And this is,
but you think you can print it, don't you? I mean, you've actually used the word, print it.
This is my view, not necessarily Corbyn and MacDonald's view, but I think any objective observer of the relationship between fiscal and monetary policy in a stressed and stagnant environment says, you do borrow what you can and you do print what you can through the Bank of England.
They're not saying that in Bury. And this notion that this great sort of revolutionary zeal is going to come to Britain and overtake the suburbs of Basingstoke and the pubs of Bury, it just isn't going to happen. And when a few years later we look back on this and we see that Jeremy Corbyn got an entirely predictable 23% of the country.
You're predicting 23%?
Yes.
We'll have you back when that's
come back.
All right.
We will have you back.
I'd love to.
For round two, when we see. Thank you both very much.